Welcome to this special presentation on the environmental history of New Jersey's Delaware Bay Shore region, sponsored by the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, a state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which has provided funding for this program. In the fall of 2011, the Council sponsored a series of community forums, inviting panels of university and community scholars to consider the relationship between New Jersey's environment and justice throughout history. Highlights of the first forum, Sharing the Delaware Bay, will be featured in this 30-minute program. The Delaware Bay is one of the most important wetland regions on the East Coast, acting as an incubator for vital fish and wildlife. Its natural beauty and resources have drawn settlers since the Lenape Indians. It's also drawn conflict. As demand for access to the bay's limited resources grow, commercial fishermen, recreational users, and environmentalists each compete to make their voices heard through environmental regulations and state or federal law. At the heart of this issue is the question of justice. Who has the right to use natural resources? How have we managed our environmental resources in the past, and how should we do so in the future? The forum was held outdoors in Bivalve, New Jersey on the Delaware Bay. The speakers and guests were welcomed by Dr. Mary Rizzo, the Interim Executive Director for the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, and Megan Wren, Director of the Bayshore Discovery Project. Dr. Michael Sharapa, Professor of History at Quinnipiac University, provided context for these questions, tracing interest in the Bay from the colonial period to the 20th century.
The first thing I want us to think about is that ever since colonization in this area, and this map that you see is a 18th century, 1770s, 1780s map of the Delaware Bay. And if you were to scrutinize it carefully, you'd see that those folks who first came to this part of the world had a very, how would I say it, their antenna, their radar was very much focused on natural resources. Colonization in this country, in what becomes the United States, is driven in large measure by the desire to develop natural resources for a variety of purposes, which we don't need to get into right now. But what bears keeping in mind is that the Delaware Bay, oftentimes, as I say, as a New Jersey historian, seems to be forgotten in all of this, that this place was an incredibly important location right from the beginnings of European settlement in the region, the time of European Indian contact, and so forth. So I think we need to think about all this through that particular lens. The other issue is that the Delaware Bay obviously is all a part of a transportation corridor. It's an ecosystem that links the Atlantic Ocean, of course, the bay, and the Delaware River into the Delaware Estuary, which is an incredibly prolific natural environment and one that also has certain natural endowments that lend itself to port development and the fostering of some very dynamic land-water relationships. And obviously the taking of natural resources and making them into the commodities that so many of you in the audience are aware of. The issue that we need to think about in terms of this environmental justice or equity issue is if Europeans cast their eyes so sharply on this region so early, it meant the competition for the resources here, right from the start, was a very highly charged issue. And it's an issue and a relationship to resources and to people that only intensifies as the country, industrializes during the 19th century. And this is a shot of Philadelphia where some of the early fish markets were, down around Spruce and Walnut Streets. And so, what changes occur that lead us to think about this issue of equity and people wanting to stake a claim to what's in the Delaware Bay? Greater commercial development, industrialization, transportation, and so forth. All you need to do, I often say to my students and the audiences like this, is to go out in that bay and look at what the federal government was doing and look at what the state government was doing in the 1800s, in the 19th century. When the feds and the states start to build structures like this, it means that the commercial stakes are rising and that in all likelihood, different competing groups are going to get a little more, how would I say it, engaged when it has to do with who's going to get what, whether it's finfish or shellfish, so forth. So I often say that lighthouses, things that the state and the government are doing, is an immediate barometer to the kind of things we're going to be talking about today. Of course, oystering, the most prolific and most marketable resource that came out of these waters, looms large in everybody's memory, right? Shad and sturgeon. Okay, another fishery which for most of us now is a memory that is sort of, the problems that afflict that most of you, I'm sure, that shad, and sturgeon faced privations well before oystering ever did in the 1950s. But as much as we celebrate oystering and shad and sturgeon fishing, the reality is not everybody was always on board. Smaller fishermen, smaller operators had, points of contention with larger, can I say, corporate interests who were involved in these enterprises. And it applies to these fisheries, whether we're talking shad, sturgeon, and it applies to, say, tongers, which you're looking at in those, well, a tonger in the upper left-hand corner, and obviously a guy working an oyster float and an oyster scow in the lower right-hand corner. How people approach the industry, again, is an issue of this equity that we're talking about, that people had competing interests. Not everybody, it wasn't all one big happy family. It's not to say that people, they got through those issues, but there were points of contention depending on how much money and how much political muscle you brought to the table.
Resource disputes, however, were not isolated to the conflicts that developed between large and small-scale commercial operations. Walter Chu, an area resident and retired waterman, identified 4 distinct interests that he encountered in his many years on the bay.
There are 4 groups that I can identify who are trying to do different things with the bay. One group is the industrial group, who want to transport oil back and forth to Philadelphia and make that an international highway. Basically, they need to do that. The part of the industrial group is also PSE&G, who needs to use water from the bay to cool their towers, or at least wants to use the water. Then you have what I call more of the industrial group, maybe the chemical companies who want to use the bay as, my sister says, a large sewer to dump things in. But I'm not trying to get political here. I'm just trying to say the chemical companies did want to do that. But then the other 3 groups that really are in conflict in the current phase here are what I call the zoo people, who want to create a zoo out of the bay, a place where we can go see the environment, look at it, see how it works, and never touch it. That's basically the environmentalists want to do that. There are then the playground people who want to have Saturday afternoon and Sunday to go out in the bay, play, have a good time interacting with these things, and take some of them home. They love to take one of everything home. And then you have the farmers or the commercial fishermen who look at the bay as if it's renewable resources, where they want to harvest what's renewable out of it and sell it and make it available to the general public. So there we have 4 groups that are trying to use the bay, and each of whatever group you're part of is one of those groups that is trying to do something with a piece of the resource in the bay.
Each of these 4 groups values the bay's resources for different reasons. As Christopher Whitney, doctoral candidate in the history and sociology of science at the University of Pennsylvania, explained in discussing the history of the red knot, a shorebird at the center of a recent political controversy. Interests shift over time. The red knot was once prized for being good to eat or good to hunt, but in the 20th century, it was seen as economically important.
What was the justification from the Biological Survey about why we should be protecting shorebirds? The answer might seem a little surprising, but when you consider where these scientists were housed, it does make a certain amount of sense. Shorebirds were to be saved from extinction for their value to agriculture. And this summarizes that quite nicely. This is a scientist publishing in a popular magazine, a scientist who works for the Biological Survey, telling us why we should care about shorebirds. Quote, "There is something more than a sentimental reason why we should take steps to save our vanishing shorebirds from extinction. The economic record is spotless. They injure no farm crop, but on the contrary feed upon many of the worst enemies of agriculture. Their continued disappearance means not only the loss of some of the most beautiful and graceful of living creatures, but also of valuable enemies of our worst insect pests." So notice a few things about this quote as well. First is an acknowledgement of other values that I've already talked about. The red knot was beautiful and graceful. But these so-called sentimental reasons were superseded by the real reason to preserve them as pest control for agriculture. So like I said, after 1918, they were effectively off the game lists. And in combination with changing tastes in hunting and with game managers and professional ornithologists sort of losing interest, they really faded. Shorebirds mostly faded from public view through most of the mid-century, 20th century. The exception to this were groups of enthusiastic amateurs, like in the Delaware Valley Ornithological Club. These were the folks who were still out there watching birds, counting birds, monitoring birds, and these were the folks that were instrumental in bringing shorebirds back into the public spotlight in the late 1970s and early 80s, when scientists at Rutgers and at the Academy of Natural Sciences and Audubon and the state of New Jersey started paying a little more attention to shorebirds and the bay itself as an important staging area for these animals. And this all, I think, sort of culminated in 1986 when the Delaware Bay was named the first site in the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, which was the 25th anniversary of this occurrence was just celebrated in Bivalve here a few months ago. So I don't want to go much longer, so I'll stop my history there. And I think probably everybody here has at least some familiarity with the current political debate over the horseshoe crab fishery and red knot conservation, and some people here have lived through it. But since we're here to talk about sharing the Delaware Bay, I think there's some potentially useful historical lessons here for us. As I pointed out, there were a wide diversity of people with a wide diversity of values for shorebirds, for nature, right? They were tasty, they were beautiful, they were fun, they were worth a little money, they were interesting to scientists, they were useful to agriculture. And when extinction looked like a real possibility, these people banded together and protected the red knot. But it was the economic reason, the reason to agriculture that seemed to matter the most. And I feel like history is repeating itself somewhat today. I see my reading of all of the government reports on the current political controversy, newspaper articles, etc., is that ecotourism seems to be the new agriculture. There are still many ways that people enjoy the bay and the birds, but when push comes to shove, the conversation keeps coming back over and over to economics, to the bay as an economic machine primed by birding tourism. So, is this a good thing or a bad thing? As Mike said many times, when we talk about environmental justice, we're talking about equity. And at first glance, comparing ecotourism to the horseshoe crab fishery sounds like equity. We can assign a dollar value to both, and then we're comparing them. But I want to suggest that even though we're using the language of money, in many ways we're still comparing apples to oranges. As I'm sure any waterman would tell you, there's a lot more to the horseshoe crab fishery than the money they get for it. It's a way of life. And I know that there are many birders who would say there's a lot more to shorebirds and the red knot than just money pumped into the local economy. So I think that, in my opinion, I think that if we're going to talk about environmental justice and equity, we want to make sure that the plurality of values for nature remain intact and don't get reduced down to a dollar value.